Gideon had told Lila he was leaving for another business trip, his suitcase packed with the usual crisp shirts and polished shoes. He'd kissed her goodbye that morning, promising to be back in time for Christmas. Later that day, he texted her a few photos, brightly wrapped Christmas gifts stacked neatly on a hotel bed, tagged with a caption, "For you and Miles, can't wait to see your faces." Their 11-year-old son, Miles, had been begging for a new gaming console, and Lila had her eye on a delicate silver necklace she'd hinted at months ago. The gesture warmed her heart, at first, but then she noticed something odd. In one of the images, a corner of a shipping label peeked into the frame, barely visible along the bottom edge. Gideon hadn't cropped it carefully enough. Squinting, Lila could just make out part of an address. 4721, zip, 82401. Her stomach twisted. She didn't need the full address to know that 82,401 wasn't anywhere near home, or the neighbouring city where Gideon's business trip was supposed to be. That zip code belonged to a different state entirely. "Gideon, where are you really at?" she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling as she stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the phone, itching to call him and demand answers. But what if she was wrong? What if this was some innocent mix-up, a client's address, a shipping error? She took a deep breath, willing her racing pulse to slow. "You're overreacting, Lila," she told herself, pacing the kitchen. "He's not." He wouldn't. Still, doubt gnawed at her. This wasn't like her. She'd never been the type to snoop. Gideon's business trips had always been routine, a fact of life for their 12-year marriage. But something about that zip code wouldn't let her go. Barely aware of what she was doing, she drifted to the family computer in the living room, the one Miles usually hogged for his video games. She sank into the chair, opened the browser and clicked into the search history, a place she'd never bothered to look before. The screen lit up with a trail of digital breadcrumbs, and her breath caught in her throat. 3 months back, there were searches for romantic weekend getaways and cozy cabins for two. Then, more recently, visits to spa resort websites, pages boasting couples massages, candlelit dinners, even a lover's cooking class, complete with wine pairings. Her chest tightened as she scrolled, each click fanning the ember of suspicion into a roaring flame. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands shaking against the mouse. "What is this, Gideon?" Her head throbbed, a dull ache pulsing behind her eyes. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to steady herself, but the room seemed to tilt anyway. Digging deeper, she found a confirmation email for a package he'd shipped to their house. Likely those Christmas gifts. But then, buried in the browser's autofill suggestions, she spotted a purchase from a boutique lingerie site. Scarlet lace, sizes she didn't wear. Her vision blurred with hot, angry tears. A quick check of their Venmo account revealed a string of payments, $50 here, $75 there, to a name she didn't recognize, Cassie L., and the final blow, a half-finished itinerary for a Las Vegas trip, complete with hotel reservations and a note about celebrating in style. Lila shoved the chair back from the desk, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Fury surged through her, molten and unstoppable. "You lying bastard," she hissed, slamming her palm against the table. The Christmas lights twinkling in the corner of the room felt like a mockery now, their cheerfulness a cruel contrast to the betrayal unraveling before her. Lila spent the next week turning her rage into a meticulous mission. She became a detective in her own home, combing through every digital crevice Gideon had left unguarded. She printed emails from his account, flirty exchanges with someone named Cassie, laced with pet names and promises of next time. She pulled credit card statements showing dinners at upscale restaurants she'd never been to, charges for spa packages, and a glaring $200 hit from that lingerie boutique. Hotel reservations, Venmo receipts, even a confirmation for a couple's massage in a town 3 states away. She stacked it all into a damning pile on the kitchen table. Each piece was a shard of glass in her chest, but she pressed on, fueled by a need to know everything. She'd planned to confront him when he returned from his business trip, imagining the look on his face when she dropped the evidence in front of him like a guillotine blade. She rehearsed the words in her head. "Explain this, Gideon. Tell me I'm wrong." But as the days dragged on, her patience frayed thinner than a thread. By Friday, with Miles at a sleepover and the house suffocatingly quiet, she couldn't hold it in any longer. Her fingers flew across her phone, typing out the message she'd been chewing on all week. "I know everything," she texted, her heart hammering as she hit send. "The trips, the gifts, Cassie, all of it. Don't even try to lie." The screen stared back at her, silent. No dots, no reply. Nothing. She refreshed the app, checked the signal, paced the living room with the phone clutched in her sweaty palm. 10 minutes passed, then 20. An hour. "Answer me, you coward," she shouted at the empty house, her voice bouncing off the walls. The silence from Gideon was louder than any excuse he could have conjured. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment, sitting smugly on the other end, unbothered by her discovery. That was the worst of it. Not the affair itself, but his refusal to even engage. No panicked apologies, no desperate explanations, not even a denial to cling to. Just a void where his response should have been. She sank onto the couch, the stack of evidence glaring at her from the table. "You don't even care enough to fight for us," she whispered, her voice cracking. The realization stung deeper than any of the receipts or emails ever could. Lila's world had shattered, and the pieces lay scattered across the house by the time Miles got home from soccer practice. She'd lost control, tearing through the living room in a blind fury. Wedding photos yanked from the walls now littered the floor, their frames splintered, glass glinting like jagged teeth. Gideon's clothes, his pressed shirts, his favourite ties, spilled out of drawers and closets in chaotic heaps. A vase she'd once loved, a gift from their 5th anniversary, lay in shards by the fireplace, smashed in a moment of white-hot rage. Her chest heaved as she stood amid the wreckage, eyes swollen and red from hours of sobbing. The front door creaked open, and Miles stepped inside, his cleats still muddy from the field. He froze wide-eyed, taking in the chaos. Broken glass crunched under his cautious steps as he picked his way toward her, his soccer bag slipping from his shoulder to the floor. "Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling with confusion. He was only 11, but his mind raced, piecing together the scene like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. A fight? A break-in? Or worse, the fear he'd buried deep, the one he'd overheard in whispers about his grandfather years ago. Their eyes met, and Lila's resolve crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks again, and before she could speak, Miles crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her. He didn't say anything at first, just held her tight, his small frame steady against her shaking one. After a moment he pulled back, searching her face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice small but firm. "I'm all right, sweetheart," she managed, brushing a hand over his messy hair. "I love you so much, you know that." Her words wobbled, but she forced a weak smile for his sake. Miles nodded, then hesitated. What happened?" Lila took a shuddering breath, guiding him to the couch, the one spot still intact amid the storm she'd unleashed. She sat him down, kneeling in front of him so they were eye level. "It's about your dad," she began, her voice low and careful. "He's been lying to us. He's not on a business trip. He's been with someone else, Miles. Another woman." She watched his face shift. Shock, then pain, then something harder, like a wall going up. She pressed on, choosing her words with care. "I need you to know this isn't okay. It's not how you treat people you love. Your dad's father, he did something like this once, left his family. Gideon swore he'd never be like that, but he broke that promise." She squeezed his hands. "You're better than this, Miles. You'll grow up to be someone who keeps their word, won't you?" He nodded faintly, but his eyes glistened with unshed tears. The blow landed harder than anything he'd ever felt. Not just the betrayal, but the way it chipped at his trust. his sense of who his father was. He'd idolized Gideon, the man who'd taught him to kick a soccer ball, who'd promised to take him camping next summer. Now that image lay in ruins, as broken as the house around them. Gideon's key turned in the lock 3 days later, and Lila braced herself, steeling her nerves for the confrontation she'd been rehearsing in her mind. She stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, the pile of evidence still spread across the table like a battle map. The house was quieter now, the debris of her rampage swept into neat piles, but the air crackled with tension as he stepped inside. His suitcase thudded to the floor and he barely glanced at her before heading straight for the bedroom, his movements brisk and purposeful. "Gideon!" she called after him, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "We need to talk." He emerged moments later, arms full of clothes he'd yanked from the closet, his jaw set in a hard line. "There's nothing to talk about," he muttered, shoving shirts into a duffel bag. "I'm getting my stuff and going." Lila followed him, her pulse pounding in her ears. "That's it? You're just walking out? How long has this been going on, Gideon? How long have you been lying to me?" He zipped the bag shut with a sharp tug and finally met her gaze, his eyes cold and distant. "Doesn't matter to you anymore, does it? It's done." Her breath hitched, but she pressed on, refusing to let him slip away without answers. "So you're leaving us? Just like that? For her? After everything we've built?" That's when he turned on her, his voice rising with a venom she'd never heard before. "Don't act like this is my fault alone, Lila. You think I wanted to stay stuck here? You were never enough for me. Too plain, too predictable. I woke up one day and realized I deserve more, someone who actually excites me, and I can get it too." His words hit her like a slap, each one sharper than the last. She stared at him, stunned, as he kept going, unloading years of resentment she hadn't known he'd been carrying. "I sold myself short marrying someone like you," he sneered, his lip curling. "Average. That's what you are. I should have aimed higher." Lila's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She could barely breathe, but he wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cruel, deliberate edge. "And let's be honest, your body, it's not what it used to be, not even close." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Those final words sank into her like daggers, piercing through every insecurity she'd ever buried, every moment she'd felt less than perfect. Her vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall, not in front of him. "Get out," she whispered, her voice raw and trembling. "Take your things and go." Gideon slung the bag over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Without another word, he walked past her, the door slamming shut behind him. Lila stood there, rooted to the spot, his insults echoing in her head. Each one twisted deeper into her heart, leaving wounds she wasn't sure would ever heal. As Gideon turned to leave, Lila's voice broke through the haze of her tears, sharp and desperate. "You promised, Gideon," she said, her words trembling but fierce. "You swore you'd never do what your father did, never abandon us like he abandoned you. Remember that? You looked me in the eyes and said it." He froze mid-step, his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. His silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold, and it only fueled her resolve. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stepped closer, her voice rising. "I gave up so much for this family. For you. I worked 2 jobs when Miles was little, juggling night shifts and daycare drop-offs so we could keep the lights on. You were off buying your fancy gadgets and taking your work trips, while I was scraping by. And now you're throwing it all away?" Gideon's shoulders tensed, and he finally spun to face her, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Enough, Lila," he snapped, cutting her off. "I don't need a lecture." He glanced at his watch, a sleek, overpriced thing she'd never liked, his impatience practically radiating off him. "I've heard it all before, and I'm done listening." Each word she flung at him seemed to bounce off, useless against his indifference. She wanted to scream, to shake him until he felt the weight of what he was doing, but he was already halfway out the door in his mind. The man she'd loved, the father of her son, was slipping away, and she couldn't stop him. In the next room, Miles sat on the edge of his bed. The door cracked just enough to hear the muffled voices spilling from the kitchen. His small hands gripped the edge of his comforter, knuckles white, as he listened to the unraveling of everything he'd known. His mother's pleas, his father's biting retorts, they seeped into him, each one a crack in the foundation of his world. He wanted to run out there, to yell at his dad to stay, to fix it, but his legs wouldn't move. Instead, he sat frozen, devastation pooling in his chest, too young to fully grasp it all but old enough to feel the ache of it breaking him apart. Before Gideon walked out for good, he paused at the threshold of Miles's room. The door was ajar and he pushed it open with a creak, stepping inside like nothing had changed. He flashed a smile, the same easy grin he'd worn 1,000 times before, and leaned against the doorframe. "Hey, champ," he said, his tone light, almost casual. "How's school going? Still acing those math tests?" Miles sat on his bed, staring at his father, the words landing like stones in his gut. He couldn't fathom it. This man who'd once been his hero, the one he'd raced to the window to spot coming home from work, the one whose laughter used to fill the house. Now that same man stood there, acting like the world wasn't collapsing around them. Hate surged through Miles, raw and unfamiliar, choking out anything he might have said. How could he answer? What was there to say to someone who'd torn everything apart? For the first time, tears spilled down Miles's cheeks. He didn't sob or beg. He just stood there, locked in his father's gaze, crying silently. These weren't tears pleading for Gideon to stay. They were tears of disbelief, of betrayal, mourning the cruelty that had replaced the man he'd known. His small frame trembled, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. Gideon shifted uncomfortably, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow. "Come on, bud, don't be like that," he said, reaching out to ruffle Miles's hair like he used to when things were simple. But Miles jerked back, his hand flying up to swat his father's away with a sharp smack. The gesture stunned them both. Then, with a quick swipe at his wet cheeks, Miles lunged forward and slammed the door shut, the bang echoing through the house. He pressed his back against it, chest heaving, wishing he could vanish, wishing he could erase his father, the pain, all of it from existence. On the other side, Gideon stood motionless for a moment, the smile gone, before turning and walking away. For weeks, the house felt like a tomb, Miles and Lila drifting through it like ghosts of who they'd been. They tried to hold each other up, offering quiet words or a fleeting touch. A hand on a shoulder, a murmured, "You okay?" But it was fragile, like trying to mend a broken vase with cracked glue. They'd sit at the kitchen table, the silence between them thick and heavy, the air buzzing with unspoken grief. Miles would stare at his untouched cereal, and Lila would clutch her coffee mug until her knuckles whitened, both of them trapped in their own spirals of pain. Things weren't good. They were unraveling. Lila barely slept anymore. Dark circles carved hollows under her eyes, and her hands trembled as she tried to pour her morning coffee, spilling it across the counter more often than not. The lack of rest gnawed at her, fraying her nerves and clouding her mind. She'd catch herself staring blankly at the wall, Gideon's words replaying in her head. Too plain, not enough, your body's not what it used to be, until her chest ached and her breath hitched. Physically, she was fading. Mentally, she was a wreck. It didn't help that work had turned into a battlefield. Her boss had pulled her aside one afternoon, voice clipped and cold. "Lila, you need to get it together. Productivity's down and we can't keep carrying dead weight. Shape up or you're out." The threat landed like a punch, but worse still were the whispers she caught in the break room, co-workers clucking their tongues, saying Gideon had told them she'd driven him away, that she'd been the problem all along. He'd spun a web of lies so deftly that people bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. Gideon had always been cunning, a master at twisting the narrative. He'd paint himself as the wounded hero, the misunderstood man who'd suffered under her supposed failings, and people lapped it up, offering him sympathy he didn't deserve. It was a pattern she knew too well. Back when they'd argued as a couple, he'd had a way of turning every fight around, his voice calm and cutting, dismantling her until she was the one apologizing, doubting her own memory, her own worth. Even now, with the truth laid bare, that old poison crept in. Late at night, as the house creaked and Miles slept fitfully down the hall, Lila sat on the edge of her bed, staring into the dark. Was it me? She wondered, her thoughts looping. Did I push him to this? Was I really not enough? The questions gnawed at her, blending with Gideon's venom until she couldn't tell where his manipulation ended and her self-doubt began. Miles's world dimmed in the weeks that followed. The things that once lit him up, soccer practice, math quizzes, the thrill of a good grade, faded into a grey haze. He'd sit at his desk, pencil idle in his hand, staring through his textbooks as if the words were written in a language he no longer understood. On the field, where he used to dart and weave with a grin, he now trudged through drills half-heartedly, if he showed up at all. The spark was gone, snuffed out by the weight of his father's betrayal. At school, the rumours slithered through the halls like poison. Whispers followed him, cruel, half-baked stories that Gideon had left because Miles and his mom weren't good enough. Kids he'd once called friends turned on him, their taunts sharp and relentless. "Guess your dad got tired of you," one sneered during lunch while another smirked. "No wonder he bailed. Look at you." It stung deep, each jab testing his fraying patience. At first he'd snap back, his voice cracking with anger as he shoved a kid or shouted something he'd later regret, but the fights only fueled the gossip. And soon he stopped fighting altogether. Instead, he folded in on himself. He'd hunch over in class, hood pulled low, avoiding eyes that once met his with smiles. His grades plummeted. C's turned to D's, then F's. His report card a graveyard of missed assignments. Skipping school became his escape. He'd leave the house with his backpack slung over one shoulder, but instead of heading to the bus stop, he'd wander, down to the park, along the creek, anywhere but where people expected him to be. The world felt too loud, too harsh, and he just wanted to disappear into the quiet. One quiet Saturday morning, the house lay still, wrapped in the heavy hush that had settled over Lila and Miles since Gideon's departure. Lila sat at the kitchen table, her coffee long gone cold, staring at the chipped edge of a plate she hadn't the energy to wash. Miles was still cocooned in his room, buried under blankets, lost to sleep or maybe just hiding from the day. The world outside felt distant, until a sharp knock rattled the front door, the first sound of life to pierce their solitude in weeks. Lila's heart jolted, a flicker of something like hope flaring despite everything. For a fleeting moment she pictured Gideon standing there, sheepish and repentant, ready to unravel the nightmare and stitch their family back together. She rose, smoothing her wrinkled sweater, and opened the door with a breath held tight in her chest. But it wasn't Gideon. It was Mrs. Betty Vinson, their neighbour from 2 houses down, a wiry, silver-haired woman with a face creased by time and kindness, leaning on a polished wooden cane. Betty didn't bother with hellos. "Lord, this damp weather's got my knees screaming again," she grumbled, thrusting a foil-covered pie into Lila's hands as if it were an afterthought. Her other hand gripped her cane, steadying her slight frame. "Feels like rain's coming and my joints know it before the weatherman does." Lila blinked, then felt a smile tug at her lips, the first real one in what felt like forever. "Come in, Betty," she said, stepping aside. "Please." Betty shuffled in, her cane tapping the floor, and launched right back into her chatter. "Had to chase that darn cat of mine off the counter twice this morning. Thinks he owns the place. Baked this apple pie to keep my hands busy. Figured you might want some." She plopped into a chair without waiting for an invitation, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room. "Where's that boy of yours?" "Miles?" "Miles," Lila called toward the hallway, her voice lifting with a warmth she hadn't heard in weeks. "Come out here." A moment later, the sound of footsteps thudded down the hall, quick and eager, Miles burst into the room, his hair a mess and his hoodie askew, curiosity lighting his face. When he saw Betty, his eyes brightened, and a grin broke through the gloom that had clung to him. "Hey, Mrs. Vinson," he said, bounding over to her. "Well, look at you, tall as a beanpole already," Betty said, reaching out to pat his arm. "You been keeping out of trouble, or do I need to have a word with you?" Her tone was teasing, her smile a balm. Betty Vinson was a fixture on their quiet street, a spry old woman who'd lived alone in her tidy little house for as long as anyone could remember. Her husband had passed years ago, and her kids were grown and scattered across the country, but she filled her days with gardening, baking, and keeping a sharp eye on the neighbourhood. Nothing slipped past her. Not the stray dog that rummaged through trash cans, not the flicker of curtains when someone argued behind closed doors, and certainly not the way Lila's car hadn't moved from the driveway in weeks, or how Miles's bike sat gathering dust by the garage. Betty noticed everything, her keen gaze softened by a heart that knew loss and carried on anyway. That morning, as she sat at Lila's kitchen table, her cane propped against the chair, she took in the faint shadows under Lila's eyes and the way Miles's shoulders slumped even as he smiled. She didn't pry, not yet, but her presence was a quiet promise that she'd seen their darkness and wasn't about to let it swallow them whole. Betty settled into the kitchen chair, her gnarled hands folding around a mug of tea Lila had set in front of her. She fixed her sharp blue eyes on Miles, who slouched across the table, picking at the edge of the pie she'd brought. "So," she began, her voice carrying that no-nonsense lilt he'd come to know from years of her waving him over to help with her garden. "I hear you've been dodging school lately, young man. That true?" Miles shrugged, his gaze dropping to the table, a flush creeping up his neck. "It's not a big deal," he mumbled. "Just don't feel like going." Betty tisked, tapping a finger against her mug. "Not a big deal, huh? Let me tell you something, Miles. Skipping out might feel good for a minute, but it's no way to fix what's eating at you." She leaned forward, her tone softening but firm. "You know, when I was about your age, my pa up and left us too. Didn't say goodbye. Just took off one night with his suitcase and a bottle of whiskey. Left my ma with 3 kids and a stack of bills." Miles glanced up, surprised, his hands stilling. Lila, standing by the counter, paused mid-wipe of a dish, listening too. Betty went on, her eyes distant but steady. "I was mad as a hornet, thought about quitting school, running off, anything to make the hurt stop. But one day, my ma sat me down and said, 'Betty, you don't let someone else's mess decide your path. You keep going, head up, because that's how you show you're stronger than what they did.' So I did. Finished school, got a job, built a life. And you know what? It didn't erase what he did, but it made me feel like I was still me, not just his leaving." She reached across the table, resting a weathered hand near his. "Your dad's choices? They're his, not yours. You skip school, you're only letting him take more from you, your future, your fight. Don't give him that power, Miles. You're too good for that." Miles swallowed hard, her words sinking in like a lifeline tossed into choppy water. It didn't fix everything. His chest still ached, and the anger still simmered. But it shifted something. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of clarity, a tiny spark of resolve. He nodded slowly, meeting her gaze. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll try." Betty smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "That's all it takes, kiddo. One step at a time." Betty turned her attention to Lila, who'd been hovering near the sink, a damp dishcloth twisted in her hands. The old woman took a sip of her tea, then set the mug down with a decisive clink. "Now, Lila, you listen up too," she said, her voice carrying that mix of grit and warmth that could cut through any gloom. "You two have been moping around here like Gideon was the sun, moon, and stars all rolled into one. Well, I've got news for you. He ain't. And I'll be darned if I let you keep grieving like he was the only thing keeping this house alive." Lila blinked, caught off guard, and Miles let out a small, surprised snort. Betty grinned, leaning back in her chair. "What? You think I'm wrong? That man strutted out of here like he was God's gift. But let me tell you something. He's just a fellow who forgot how to count his blessings. You, Lila, you're just getting started. Life ain't over because he decided to play the fool. Everything's still ahead of you. New days, new chances. You're not some wilted flower. You're a woman who's carried this family on her back. And after every struggle, darling, comes the ease. That's the way it works. The words hung in the air, sharp and bright, and then Miles chuckled. A real laugh, soft but genuine. Lila's lips twitched, and soon she was laughing too, a sound that felt foreign after so many weeks of silence. Betty, you make it sound so simple, she said, shaking her head, a smile breaking through the exhaustion. Simple? Betty raised an eyebrow, smirking. Nah, it's hard as hell sometimes. But you're tougher than the tough stuff, and don't you forget it. As Betty's words settled over the kitchen like a warm blanket, Lila felt something shift inside her, a quiet, tentative release she hadn't thought possible. For the first time since she'd uncovered Gideon's double life, since the betrayal had clawed its way into her heart, she sensed a crack in the wall of pain she'd built around herself. Betty became their unexpected guardian angel, a wiry bundle of grit and grace who swooped into their lives just when they needed it most. Every evening, like clockwork, her cane would tap up their porch steps, and she'd knock with some flimsy excuse dangling from her lips. Ran out of salt again? Mind sparing a pinch? She'd say. Or, my darn stove's acting up. Thought I'd see if you've got a spare burner. She'd shuffle inside, pie or a jar of jam in hand, and within minutes, the salt or stove was forgotten. She'd settle into a chair, launching into tales of her wild youth, neighbourhood gossip, or the antics of her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who she swore was plotting to take over the world. An hour would slip by, filled with her raspy laughter and rambling wisdom, and by the time she left, usually with a "well shoot, what had I come for again?" the house felt lighter, warmer, alive. Time crept forward, and with it, the slow stitch of healing began to mend Lila and Miles. Lila found her footing again, stepping away from the grinding job that had drained her soul. She'd pushed herself to the brink for years, always under Gideon's shadow, his constant demands and subtle jabs keeping her on edge. Now, free of that weight, she landed a new gig. Less stressful, more her. It was a small office job with a local florist, arranging orders and chatting with customers, her hands brushing petals instead of punching clocks. She'd come home with a faint smile, the scent of lilies clinging to her clothes, finally doing something that felt like hers. Miles, too, was carving out his own path. The taunts at school still stung, those mean kids with their venomous whispers, but he was learning to tune them out, to let their words slide off like rain on a window pane. He and Lila had started talking about a fresh start, transferring to a new school next year, one without the baggage of rumours and cruel faces. The thought lit a spark in him. He could almost taste the freedom from the toxic pack that hounded him. He threw himself into what mattered, his studies, his soccer. He'd stay late at practice, kicking the ball with a focus that drowned out the noise, and at night he'd hunch over his desk, determined to pull his grades back up. Distractions faded, and bit by bit, he was finding his way back to himself. Life had finally started to feel like it was inching forward, the sharp edges of Gideon's memory dulling with each passing day as Lila and Miles rebuilt their world. They'd fought hard to let him go, to bury the hurt beneath new routines and small victories. But one ordinary afternoon, the past came crashing back, uninvited and relentless. Miles was sprawled on the couch, his laptop balanced on his knees, buzzing with excitement. Lila had finally agreed to splurge on a new gaming console. His old one was scratched and sluggish, and he'd been itching for an upgrade. "Sell the old one online," she'd suggested over breakfast, tossing him a casual nod. "Craigslist's easy enough." He'd never sold anything before, and the idea of navigating it solo felt like a little adventure. He cracked his knuckles, opened the site on their shared home computer, and started typing up an ad, grinning at the thought of pocketing some cash. As the page loaded, he noticed the inbox icon blinking, unanswered queries piling up. Curious, he clicked it, expecting spam or random junk. A handful of messages popped up, all eerily similar. Is this still available? Can you ship it? Any scratches? Frowning, he opened one, his eyes darting to the item in question. The screen flashed a photo, and his breath caught hard in his throat. Staring back at him was a pair of delicate silver earrings, dangling teardrops with tiny blue stones. His heart sank. He knew those earrings. He'd begged Gideon to buy them for Lila's birthday 3 years ago, trailing after him in the mall, pointing at the display case. "Mum would love these, Dad, come on!" Gideon had grumbled but caved, and Lila had worn them every chance she got, until she didn't. Miles's mind raced. Lila had complained lately about her memory slipping, misplacing things around the house. "I swear I'm losing it," she'd said just last week, rifling through her jewelry box. "Can't find half my stuff anymore, including those earrings you picked out." He'd brushed it off then, figuring they'd turn up under a dresser or in a coat pocket, but now, here they were, listed for sale by someone, by Gideon, on their own computer, the account still logged in under his old email. The betrayal hit like a punch, fresh and raw, dragging every buried wound back to the surface. Miles's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the Craigslist ad glaring back at him like a taunt. He could still see that day in the mall so clearly, his 7-year-old self tugging Gideon's sleeve, pointing at the glass case where those silver earrings sparkled under the lights. "Those ones, Dad, the ones with the blue stones, they'd look so cool on Mom." Gideon had squinted at the price tag, his jaw tightening. "They're a bit much, Miles. How about something else? There's cheaper stuff over there." But Miles had planted his feet, stubborn and sure. "No, these are perfect. She'll love them, I know it." Gideon had sighed, muttering under his breath, but he'd handed over his card and Miles had beamed, proud of his victory. Now the memory twisted into something bitter. Just the thought of his father, of having a father at all, sent a sharp, electric pang through his chest, like a wire snapping under too much strain. It dragged everything back, the sound of Gideon's voice that last day dripping with venom as he tore into Lila. "You're not enough. Sold myself short. Your body's not what it used to be." Miles had heard it all from his room, each word a blade that carved deeper than he'd let on. The man who'd once grumbled but bought those earrings for him, for them, had become the man who'd shredded their family without a backward glance. The hurt flared anew, bright and searing, and Miles clenched his fists, fighting the urge to smash the screen just to make it stop. His eyes flicked to the sidebar, drawn to an older message buried in the inbox. His curiosity, or maybe his anger, pushed him to click it. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." As he scanned the exchange, his stomach churned. The buyer had written, "Got the earrings today. Beautiful. Thanks for the quick shipping." Gideon, or whoever was behind the account, had replied, "Glad you like them. They were my wife's, but she passed a while back. Needed the cash more than the memories." The buyer responded with, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. They're stunning. She had great taste. I'll send an extra $20, just because." Miles reread it, his breath shallow, disbelief crashing over him like a wave. His mom? Dead? A lie, bold and shameless, typed out by the man who'd walked out on them. Those earrings, the ones Lila thought she'd misplaced, hadn't been lost at all. They'd been sold off by Gideon, pawned with a sob story to squeeze out a few extra bucks. The same earrings Miles had fought for, that Lila had cherished, now in some stranger's hands because his father couldn't be bothered to care. Fury ignited in his chest, hot and wild. He slammed the laptop shut, his hands shaking as he stood up, pacing the room. How could he? Amid the heat, a spark of an idea flared to life. He didn't breathe a word of it to Lila. She'd never go for it, not with how raw everything still was. Instead, he kept it locked tight in his chest, his resolve hardening as he reopened the laptop and combed through the message exchange again. There it was, buried in the buyer's reply. A phone number, casually tossed in for shipping details. He scribbled it on a scrap of paper, his heart thudding with a mix of nerves and determination. That evening, while Lila was distracted folding laundry in the living room, Miles slipped into his room and shut the door. He pulled out his phone, a hand-me-down from Lila, and punched in the number, his thumb hovering over the call button. With a deep breath, he pressed it. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" Hi," Miles started, his voice shaky but firm. "Did you buy a pair of earrings recently? Silver ones with blue stones?" There was a pause, then the man's tone sharpened. "Who's this? What's going on?" Miles swallowed, steadying himself. "My name's Miles. Those earrings, they might be my mum's. My dad sold them to you, I think. I found the ad on Craigslist." The man went quiet, and Miles rushed on before he lost his nerve. "He told you his wife passed away, right? That's what he wrote. But she's alive. My mum's alive. He lied to you. He just left us, and I guess he sold her stuff to make money." A low wow rumbled through the phone, followed by a dry chuckle. "That's something else. How old are you, kid?" "Turning 12 soon," Miles said, sitting straighter as if the man could see him. "12, huh? You're a sharp one for your age, figuring all this out." The man's voice softened, a hint of admiration threading through it. "Listen, if what you're saying checks out, and I've got no reason to doubt you, I'll return those earrings back. No charge. I just want to make sure I'm not being scammed, you know." Miles gripped the phone tighter, a mix of excitement and impatience bubbling up. "Could we then meet up?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "Like, in person?" The man hesitated, then let out a gentle but firm sigh. "Look, Miles, I get it, but meeting strangers, especially from online, isn't safe. Not under any circumstances. You don't know me, and I don't know you. It's better this way, trust me." Miles slumped a little, the reality sinking in. For a split second, he wished he were 18, old enough to handle this on his own terms. But then he straightened up, an idea sparking. "Okay, what if you came to our house? Like, as a guest? My mum would be here too." There was a pause, then the man chuckled softly. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." "All right, if your mum's okay with it, I'll come by. Just run it by her first. No surprises, deal?" "Deal," Miles said, grinning. He scribbled down the man's name, Tom, and hung up, his mind already racing. That evening, he did his homework, poking around online to make sure Tom seemed legit. A quick search of the number tied it to a local address, and the guy's Craigslist history showed a string of normal trades. Tools, a bike, nothing shady. Satisfied, Miles took a deep breath and headed to the kitchen. Lila was at the stove stirring a pot of soup, the steam curling around her tired but steady face. "Mom," Miles started, leaning against the counter, "we're having a guest over tomorrow." She turned, eyebrow arched, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "A guest? Who's this mystery person? Don't tell me it's some girl from school sneaking over to see my boy." She winked, teasing, expecting a blush or a laugh. Miles didn't laugh. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened the screenshot he'd saved. The Craigslist ad with the earrings, their silver curves and blue stones unmistakable. He held it up, watching her face. Lila's smile faltered, then vanished. Her eyes widened, flicking from the screen to Miles, confusion giving way to something sharper, recognition, then a flicker of pain. Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice tight, the ladle still in her hand, dripping broth onto the floor. The next day, the doorbell chimed through the house, a crisp sound that jolted Miles from his spot on the couch. He sprang up, beating Lila to the door, and swung it open. A tall, stately man stood there, his hair neatly combed, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. In his hands, he cradled a small, plain box. "You must be Miles," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I'm Rudy. Nice to finally meet you." Miles grinned, shaking his outstretched hand with a firm grip he'd practiced in his head. "Hi, Rudy. Yeah, I'm Miles. Come in." He stepped aside, ushering him into the living room where Lila waited, smoothing her sweater with nervous fingers. "Mom, this is Rudy," Miles said, gesturing between them. Lila offered a tentative smile, extending her hand. "Hi, Rudy. I'm Lila. It's good to meet you." "Pleasure's mine," Rudy replied, shaking her hand gently before settling into the armchair across from the couch. "You've got quite a detective here, Lila. This kid tracked me down like it was nothing." Lila laughed, a soft, surprised sound, glancing at Miles with a mix of pride and disbelief. "Trust me, I'm as shocked as you are. He's full of surprises lately." They all sat, the air buzzing with a quiet curiosity, and Rudy leaned forward and began to speak. 5 years ago, he started, his tone shifting to something softer, I bought a pair of earrings just like these for my wife, Christy. Silver, with those little blue stones, exact same design. We were on vacation in Maine and she lost them somewhere along the coast. Broke her heart. She loved them. Said they made her feel pretty, and hell they did. She was gorgeous in them. He paused, his fingers brushing the edge of the box, and Lila and Miles listened, drawn in by the weight in his voice. Then Christy got sick. Cancer. It hit fast. Too fast. Docs gave her months and we watched them slip away. Near the end, we'd sit together, flipping through old photos, talking about the good days, and in every picture where she was beaming, really happy, she had those earrings on. They were like a piece of her joy. Rudy's eyes glistened, but he smiled faintly. I promised her I'd find a pair just like them before she went. Wanted to take her on one last date, nothing fancy, just dinner in the backyard, her in those earrings feeling beautiful again. I loved her so much, and I wanted her to have that. Lila and Miles sat in rapt silence, hanging on Rudy's every word. Lila's chest tightened as she watched him speak, his voice thick with love and loss. The way he described Christy, her smile, her joy in those earrings, felt so raw, so real that it stirred something deep in her. She could see the devotion in his eyes, the kind of love she'd once dreamed of, and the quiet devastation of losing it. Miles, beside her, leaned forward slightly, his young face soft with empathy, caught up in the story of a man who'd fought to hold on to a memory. Rudy shifted in his chair and he pressed on. After months of searching, I finally tracked down a pair, those earrings on Craigslist. I messaged the seller right away, told him I'd pay whatever he asked, but he said he was out of town, couldn't ship them yet. I waited, kept checking in, hoping they'd get here in time. But Christy, she didn't make it. She slipped away before I could get them to her. His voice dipped, a crack running through it. A couple weeks later, the guy, your Gideon, messaged me out of the blue, asked if I still wanted them. I said yes, even though it was too late for that last date. Bought them anyway, felt like keeping a promise even if she wasn't here to see it. Lila's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her hand resting over her heart. That's beautiful, Rudy, she said softly. The way you loved her. It's incredible. I can't imagine how much that meant to her, knowing you'd go that far. Rudy gave a small, grateful nod, then opened the box, revealing the earrings nestled in a bed of cotton. The silver glinted, the blue stones catching the light, and Lila's breath hitched. She'd forgotten how lovely they were. They're yours, Rudy said, holding the box out to her. Miles tracked them down for you. They belong here. Lila shook her head, pushing it gently back. No, Rudy, you should keep them. They mean so much to you, Christy's memory. I'd feel wrong taking them. But they're yours, he insisted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Your boy fought for them. I've got my memories. I don't need these to hold on to her. They went back and forth, voices overlapping in a quiet tug of war, until Miles finally threw up his hands. Geez, why don't you just split them? He said, half exasperated, half amused. 1 earring each. What's the big deal? Lila and Rudy froze, then burst out laughing, bright, unrestrained peals that filled the room. Oh, Miles, Lila said, wiping her eyes. You're something else. Rudy chuckled, shaking his head. Kid's got a point. Simplest solution I've heard all day. The tension broke, and for a moment the weight of their shared losses felt lighter. That evening, the house buzzed with a warmth it hadn't known in months. Miles had dashed next door to fetch Betty, and soon the four of them were gathered around the kitchen table. Rudy, ever the gentleman, had brought a chocolate cake, rich and layered, with a glossy frosting that made Miles's eyes widen. Lila sliced it up, the scent of cocoa mingling with the faint tang of Betty's apple pie from days before, and they settled in, plates clinking as they passed around forks and napkins. Between bites, Rudy and Miles recounted the earrings saga to Betty, who listened with her usual sharp attention, her cane propped against the table. When they finished, she leaned back, a playful smile crinkling her face. "Well now," she said, her eyes twinkling as they flicked between Lila and Rudy. "Didn't I tell you, Lila? Hard times bring easy times. And here's Rudy, strolling in like a little ray of sunshine, Lila's fork paused mid-air, and she shot Betty a mock glare, her lips twitching. "Oh, come on, Betty, you're barking up the wrong tree." "That's not what this is about." She waved a hand, half laughing. "Were you even listening, or are you just spinning your own story over there?" Betty chuckled, undeterred, popping a bite of cake into her mouth. "Oh, I heard every word, Missy." "Boy tracks down earrings. Rudy's got a heart of gold. You're all laughing like old pals. I'm just saying it's no accident." She winked, her tone teasing but her gaze sharp, like she saw something brewing beneath the surface that no one else had clocked yet. Betty's knack for sniffing out fate proved spot on. Rudy didn't fade into a one-off visitor. He, Lila, and Miles stayed tethered, a quiet thread of connection weaving through their lives. He'd swing by every couple of weeks, always with something sweet in tow, a box of donuts, a tray of brownies, once even a towering lemon meringue pie that had Miles drooling before it hit the table. Lila watched him over coffee, noting the way he never pushed, never hinted at anything beyond simple company. She figured he was just lonely, a man carrying his own ghosts, and she admired him for it. His normalcy, his lack of pretense. But Rudy, it turned out, had a fire simmering beneath that gentle exterior, and a plan he'd kept close to his chest. One crisp afternoon, Rudy tracked Gideon down. He'd pieced together enough from Lila's offhand mentions and Miles's bitter asides to find him, holed up in a cheap apartment 2 towns over, a far cry from the life he'd abandoned. Rudy parked his truck, straightened his jacket, and knocked. When Gideon opened the door, bleary-eyed and unshaven, Rudy offered a tight smile. "Hey there, remember me?" Gideon squinted, scratching his jaw, his memory sluggish. Should I?" Rudy's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "You sold me your wife's earrings, silver blue stones, Craigslist, couple years back." Recognition flickered across Gideon's face, followed by a startled laugh. "No kidding?" "Small world. What the hell are you doing out here?" "I came looking for you," Rudy said, stepping closer, his voice dropping low. He glanced at the woman hovering behind Gideon, some new face, probably Cassie, and muttered, "Sorry about this, ma'am." Before Gideon could react, Rudy's fist cracked against his jaw, sending him stumbling back with a grunt. "You're a damn coward," Rudy snarled, towering over him as Gideon clutched his face. "What you did to your wife and kid, spinning lies, selling their lives off like garbage. I hate men like you." Gideon sputtered, wide-eyed, blood trickling from his lip. "What the— You're crazy, get out!" Rudy didn't budge. He pulled the earrings from his pocket, holding them up so they caught the light. "Recognize these? I've got friends in the police, Gideon. What you pulled, fraud, theft, whatever you want to call it, could land you in a cell. Unless you do something for me." His voice was steel, unyielding, and for the first time Gideon looked genuinely afraid, cornered by a man who'd turned his own deceit into a weapon. Rudy loomed over Gideon, the earrings glinting in his fist like a silent accusation. "Here's the deal," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through Gideon's panicked breathing. You go back to Lila and Miles. You get on your knees and you beg for their forgiveness. Properly, like a man who knows what he's done. Do it, or I'll make sure the cops hear about your little scam. Theft, fraud, take your pick. You'll rot in a cell if I have anything to say about it. Gideon's bravado crumbled, his eyes darting between Rudy's unflinching stare and the woman behind him, who'd backed away, wide-eyed. He was a coward through and through. Rudy had pegged him right. The threat of prison, the cold reality of consequences outweighed any shred of pride he might have clung to. He wiped the blood from his lip, muttering curses under his breath, but he nodded, a jerky, reluctant surrender. Days later, Gideon showed up at the house unannounced, his shoulders hunched and his face a mix of resentment and defeat. Lila answered the door, freezing at the sight of him, while Miles peeked from the hallway, his fists clenching instinctively. Without a word, Gideon dropped to his knees on the porch, the wood creaking under him, and looked up at them with eyes that didn't quite meet theirs. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice flat, forced. "For everything, the lies, the leaving, all of it. I'm asking you to forgive me." Lila's breath caught, her hand gripping the doorframe. Miles stepped forward, his jaw tight, staring down at the man who'd once been his world. They could see it. The apology wasn't for them, not really. It was a transaction, a plea to save his own skin, not because they deserved it or because he'd grown a conscience. The air thrummed with the hollowness of it. But there he was, on his knees, just as Rudy had demanded. A coward to the end, bending not out of love but fear. When the dust finally settled, Lila found herself caught in a strange, quiet storm of emotions. Gideon's forced apology had left a bitter taste, but it wasn't what lingered in her mind. It was Rudy, this man who'd stormed into their lives, a stranger who'd seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself. He'd stood up to Gideon, not for any gain of his own, but because it was right, because she and Miles deserved better. It left her feeling oddly buoyant, like a weight had shifted, even if Rudy was still just a figure on the edges of her world, a kind, steady presence who brought cake and didn't ask for much in return. Miles, though, didn't see Rudy as a stranger at all. To him, Rudy was something else entirely, a living, breathing version of the father he'd always wished Gideon could be. Strong, honest, someone who fought for what mattered. As he watched Rudy drop by with his quiet smiles and easy stories, an idea took root in Miles's head. Rudy and his mom, they fit, didn't they? She laughed more when he was around, her shoulders loosened, and Rudy's eyes softened when he looked at her. Miles wasn't blind to it, even at 12, but he'd need help to nudge them along, and who better than the neighborhood's resident meddler? Betty was the obvious choice. With her sharp wit and knack for seeing through people, she'd been dropping hints about Rudy since that first cake night. Miles caught her on her porch one afternoon, watering her geraniums. "Hey, Mrs. Vinson," he said, kicking at a pebble. "You think Mum and Rudy would, go out sometime?" Betty lowered her watering can, a grin spreading slow and sly across her face. "Oh, I've been waiting for you to ask, kiddo. Those two? They're halfway there already. They just need a push. Leave it to me." She winked, and Miles knew he'd picked the perfect partner in crime. Betty was already plotting, and with her in his corner, Rudy and Lila didn't stand a chance of staying just friends.